there are small ways to start disrupting the system, right? And I think a big part of that is just the consciousness raising, having conversations like this, acknowledging it, talking about it.
Welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. I'm your host, Emily Hardy, a mom of two on a mission to help moms everywhere feel less alone. This is not a parenting podcast. Instead, it's a space for pushing back against societal expectations of perfection and embracing self-compassion in your motherhood journey. Let's get into it. Welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. Today we are tackling a pretty massive, lofty topic, but I think it's really important and really timely based on the fact that there is a lot of conversation in politics about motherhood, about different things having to do with women's rights, reproductive rights, childcare, like all these things happening. There's a lot of conversation that I think we are seeing very clearly, this idea that motherhood is political. And that statement right there, motherhood is political, is one that is really important in the work that I'm doing and the conversations I'm having. And yet it is something that I find myself sometimes having a hard time wrapping my brain around. And so I wanted to just tackle it right here in an episode. And I have a fantastic guest joining us to do just that. We have Christina Klein here. She is a licensed therapist specializing in matrescence and maternal mental health, and she has a background in reproductive health. She worked with Planned Parenthood. She's a certified perinatal mental health specialist, a fair play facilitator, really focused on empowering mothers and families to navigate modern parenthood with confidence and resilience, which is so important. It is crucial work that you're doing, and I love just all the parts of your background that you bring to that work. Christina, welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. Can you just tell us about yourself, give us a little of your background and what brought you to the work that you do as a matrecentric therapist?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me, Emily. I'm just really excited to be here. So yes, I'm Christina Klein. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, born and raised. I have been a therapist for over a decade, but my kind of passion and interest for women's health, reproductive health started, like decades ago when I was in high school and college and getting involved in volunteering for different programs. As you mentioned, I worked at Planned Parenthood after I graduated from college, and I just loved my experience there. It was such an incredible opportunity to just be helping to advocate and support women and families. But I found that I was wanting to dive deeper into kind of the emotional lives of women and families. So I realized it was time to go back and continue my education to become a therapist. So I did that, and I worked as a therapist and a school counselor for many years. And then I became a mom. And like many in this field, it kind of is just this wild reawakening, this awakening around like, oh my gosh, this is this incredible transformation. I had been in this space, working in this space for a long time, and yet it's totally different when you go through it yourself. And so I kind of going through my own matrescence really just realigned my dedication and interest for this work. So I kind of just jumped full in, left the work that I was doing to really prioritize and focus in private practice around women and matrescence and motherhood. And I haven't looked back. It's just like such a passion to hold space and support women in this journey, kind of no matter where they are. I think being a mom right now is really hard. And so I just feel really called to this work and love talking about all things motherhood.
I love it. I get giddy talking to other women who are so passionate about supporting moms and having these conversations, because it's like, what a time to be alive.
Right? Yeah. It's pretty awesome. So, and yes, I'm also a mom, as I mentioned, and I have two boys myself. So I have a 3.5-year-old and an almost 6-year-old. So kind of experiencing what it's like to be raising boys in this culture. And they just really humble me every day and just remind me why this work is so important.
I have two sons that are just turned 6 and 3.5. So I am
so
right
there. You're in it. Yeah.
And it is quite an experience navigating that and navigating the different pieces of how our generation has opportunities to do things differently than past generations and what that looks like. And we're still living in this current modern world, and a lot is changing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're really going to get into this idea of motherhood being political. I think before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about matrescence, because that is something we have talked explicitly about on the podcast, but it has been a while. And so I'm hoping you can maybe define that for us and talk about why supporting mothers in that period or in that experience, because I don't even know if defining it
Yeah.
as a period is correct, but
Yeah,
what does that mean?
totally. Okay, awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. And actually, I know you had Chelsea Robinson on your
She's
podcast to talk
amazing.
about matrescence. And actually, she's a good friend and a mentor to
Ugh,
me. So it kind of like finds like. And so she, has been really instrumental in helping me kind of make sense and learn about all of this. But yes, so this idea of matrescence, I always think of it like adolescence matrescence, right? We know that adolescence is this huge kind of emotional, hormonal, physical, psychological transformation that kids go through, right? And it's interesting because I worked with adolescents for many years. So I was very comfortable in kind of like the messiness of that. And there's a lot of parallels between kind of adolescence and then matrescence, which is the kind of transformation that a woman goes through in becoming a mom, right? The physical transformation, the emotional, hormonal, psychological transformation. I mean, it is like a metamorphosis of it, right? Like it's hard to even wrap your head around like how big of a shift it is. And so it's kind of like acknowledging that from a more developmental stance, that it's a developmentally appropriate and important experience that women go through, right? That they kind of come out of it an entirely different person, perhaps, than who they were, right? Of course, retaining parts of who they are and their values and identity, but also this opportunity for expansion and for growth and for stretching and all these different parts of it. So it's really like just this cracking wide open, experience or phenomenon that is just so ripe and rich for exploration, but it also needs to be normalized because it is messy and it's hard and challenging. And it's very easy to pathologize motherhood and
Mhm.
pathologize, kind of the hardness of it. And so when we talk about it and normalize it, it gives words to the experience that pretty much, every woman goes through.
Yeah, I know in that episode that you referred to with Chelsea Robinson, we talk a lot about just the importance of language and having that language to describe and explore the experience. And I definitely
Yeah.
am going to link that in the show notes for
Oh,
anyone who
great.
hasn't
Yeah.
listened to that because
Yeah.
it's a really great episode. Talks about it more in depth, but it's
Mm.
such an important conversation to have, the transformation that does happen and that will happen and how that can be supported in such tangible ways. And I don't know that I do know that we have not traditionally supported
Yeah.
women through that, at least in like modern history, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think that's part of what I know we're going to be getting
Yeah.
into around kind of like how it can become political or how it kind of radicalizes women because you go through this experience of
Mhm.
matrescence, you go through becoming a mother, and you realize, oh, wow, we are not being supported. We are not being held. We are not being cared for the way that we are deserving of. And so there's this kind of awakening for some people, and not to, many people, marginalized community, women of color have been experiencing some of these more oppressive aspects of it, well before motherhood. But there's this way in which when you become a mom, it kind of hits you wide open just
Mhm.
how undersupported we are. And that is a lot of it has to do with more of the kind of societal, political infrastructures and systems in place, right? Which then becomes into the public, more political sphere of motherhood.
Yeah, it's almost like there's the internal transformation, but there's also the
Yeah,
transformation of how you then fit into the greater context of society. And a lot of that
yeah.
is like the lack of support, whether that's, again, individualized support or just
Mhm.
like the workplace, the way the workplace
Yeah.
handles things, the way
Mhm.
childcare is available and how that falls on the mom and these things.
Mhm.
I know I think I read something somewhere. I don't know if it was a quote from someone, but speaking as a white woman, it was something about how sometimes motherhood or oftentimes motherhood is the first time
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
somebody in a position like me would face
Mhm.
oppression or like
Yeah.
experience that in a real way. And I think that
Yeah.
it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to recognize
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
it's not to say that that's the first time every woman has experienced depression
Mhm.
at all, because that's
Mhm.
not true.
Mm.
But it can be just a wake up call of like, oh, there's a lot going on in our world that we may not focus on until we're thrown into
Exactly.
motherhood and
Yeah.
realize, oh, there's not the support here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this kind of face to face experience of how flawed these
Hmm.
systems and infrastructures are. And that I think embedded in that is this opportunity for activism, for social change, right? And this idea that, like, and I know Chelsea Robinson talks about this a lot, like, it's not just a me problem, it's a we problem,
Hmm.
right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm doing this wrong. I'm not a good mom. Why can't I do it as I wanted to, or I look around and see other people doing it. Why can't I do it? Right? Something must be wrong with me. And so when it becomes more of a collective awareness of like, oh no, this is a we problem. This is a systemic issue, right? The context matters. And so being able to acknowledge that, right, it kind of activates and it can propel someone into, okay, this is not okay. This is not right. This is not fair. What do we do to change it? Right. And so I think that's where this idea of it kind of radicalizing people comes into play, because you're like, this is something that I want to look at and change, right? And then you also have these little people, these little humans that we're raising, and that we feel the loftiness, the responsibility of, raising the next generation and imparting the values and those parts of it, and also like safety and all these things that are really kind of come into your vantage point so closely when you become a
Mhm.
mom, that I think it's like this experience of like, when we become mothers for all children. And it just this like collective awareness of, the injustices and opportunities for, pushing against some of those systems of oppression.
Yeah. So, kind of bringing this to a more
Mhm.
concrete place,
Yeah.
which I know there's like so many ways to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to like, what does this mean? Motherhood is political in a really concrete way. What specific issues can we look at?
Hmm. Hmm.
Just explain that to us the best you can.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think what I see and what I experience is that, you kind of go through this and you're like, oh my gosh, and I remember feeling this as a new mom, like, we are not doing enough. Women are struggling. We're challenged, this is not okay. And this kind of desire and want to fix it and to make it better. And at the same time, many people are still kind of in the throes of early parenthood and the just intensiveness of being a parent and mothering, right? Or maybe experiencing a mental health challenge or a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder, and so I think it's also recognizing kind of from more of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs standpoint, like, how do you kind of tend to yourself first, right? Like, kind of as an act of resistance of self-care, like, okay, I recognize there's these systemic things that I want to help dismantle, that I want to help kind of address. And yet, I'm still healing or I'm still recovering. So, kind of also giving permission to take up space, right? To ask for what you need, to receive support and help, right? Like, I think that kind of foundationally is such an important piece, because it's very easy to kind of jump into like, okay, I want to get involved. I'm angry, I'm pissed off, like, I want to make a difference. And sometimes that isn't the reality of where we are. And yet there are small ways to start disrupting the system, right? And I think a big part of that is just the consciousness raising, having
Mhm.
conversations like this, acknowledging it, talking about it is a really kind of good first place of just like, oh, do you know that there's a thing called matrescence that we all go through? Some of these things, that kind of just naming it and calling it out, I think can be a really good place to just kind of start. And then when, maybe a person is feeling more equipped or have more bandwidth to take on more, right? Then kind of looking at what that looks like based on different interests or causes that are kind of near and dear to someone's heart, or situations that they specifically want to address, whether it's locally or federally, kind of starting with what matters to them.
I want to dig into that a little more, what you said
Okay.
there about how taking care of ourselves and
Yeah.
doing things differently than we
Hmm.
systematically are told we should, basically. Like, we're
Yeah.
told we should run ourselves into
Yeah.
the ground, and that's the expectation. And when we choose to say, I'm not doing it this way,
Hmm.
how that is
Hmm.
an act of resistance. Can
Yeah.
you dive
Yeah.
into that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is looking at some of the ideas and beliefs that culturally or societally we're told, right? This kind of myth of being like the perfect mother, right? And kind of that the ideal mother is all sacrificing, all giving, kind of putting everybody else before themselves, right? And as we know, that can lead to burnout and depletion and anger, resentment, all of these things, right? True mental health challenges, right? And so being able to say, wait, hold on, I am a mother, right? But I'm also a human and I matter. And I want to model showing up for myself and taking care of myself, the whole putting my oxygen mask on first for myself, but also for my children, right? And thinking, how do I want to model that for them? for many people, a big departure from maybe what was modeled to them,
Yeah.
what they saw growing up, right? And it is this kind of countercultural response against kind of like this myth of what it means to be the ideal mother, right? And so kind of naming that, addressing it, calling it out, and starting to challenge it in those ways.
I think it's important to recognize the value that like tuning into conversations like this
Yeah.
has, having conversations like this. And you said that, like how having the conversations, educating yourself on what it really looks like from a external perspective, like what
Yeah.
mothers are going through, what we ourselves as individuals are going through in the context of
Hmm.
society, how huge that impact can be
Yeah.
just in how then you are passing on
Hmm.
different norms to your children,
Yeah.
how you are then able to make choices that may be resisting what culture is
Hmm.
telling us we should be doing that may actually be better for everybody. And
Hmm.
I think calling that out and just like
Hmm.
anyone who is listening to this right now, you are
Hmm.
doing something to make a difference.
Yeah.
Might be small, but it is
Absolutely.
something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what other thing like raising the next generation of children, that is the ultimate act of activism, right? And
Mhm.
advocacy, right? Is embedding values and beliefs and things. I mean, that is the ultimate. Now we operate in a society that really undervalues the work of mothering, right? And so it's like pushing back on that, right? It's acknowledging that this is really important. And the conversations that we're having, the awareness that we're drawing, helping our children to understand and see things that aren't fair or unjust, or kind of helping them make those connections. We're in a political landscape right now where we have a woman presidential candidate, right? And what that means, and having conversations with my son, like just understanding, like, isn't that interesting? We've never had a female president, and his kind of really basic, sweet, like, well, why is that? Does it make sense? That's not fair. Right. And so helping them have these conversations, right? That's absolutely an act of resistance and an act of activism that doesn't have to be a big grand gesture, going to a protest or, running for a local office. It can be these really intentional conversations that we're having at home with our children and with our friends and family, kind of more of that relational organizing, which we know is a really, really effective way of, sharing and helping to educate people.
Yeah. You're kind of speaking to this, but I think sometimes I can fall into this trap, and I'm sure other moms feel this way of when we're thinking about motherhood as political and we're thinking about these things that we can care about, we need to care about, however we're framing it, it can feel like a lot of responsibility
Yeah.
too. And in a few different ways, I'm thinking like it feels like a lot of responsibility, like, well, I just chose to have kids, and why now do I have to claim
Hmm.
this kind of activist
Hmm.
position? But then
Hmm.
also in a lot of ways, right? Like these issues aren't necessarily mom's issues, even
Yeah.
though they actually might fall on moms.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
holding that
Hmm.
as like, okay, well,
Yeah.
childcare, why is that a mom's problem? But
Why
the
is it me?
reality is,
Yeah.
it is.
Hmm. Hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? How do we like
Yeah. Yeah.
navigate that?
Totally. God, I think that is such a good point. And it is at times can feel so infuriating because you're like, okay, I'm acknowledging, I'm seeing and highlighting this flawed system, right? These areas of oppression. And yet, how do I have the time and space to take on more, to do more, right? And acknowledging that it is on all of us to kind of help and shoulder some of those things, but it doesn't have to be just one person alone. And so having community, having people to talk about kind of the realities of it, like, I'm so angry, I'm so burnt out, I'm so kind of mad at what I'm seeing, and recognizing, like, what does that look like right now, right?
Mhm.
Is the kind of focus on tending to myself and kind of prioritizing, recognizing, like, I'm depleted, I need to prioritize me and kind of recuperate so that I then have the bandwidth to want to do more. Or is it, okay, I want to channel this anger, this frustration into something? And I think there's this way in which we can kind of like lean on each other to support through that.
Mhm.
So like when one person's kind of more activated or more, engaged, it's like, okay, kind of following their lead. And then they may need to kind of tap out. And then it's like, okay, so there's a way in which it doesn't have to be fully one person's responsibility. That's how I've found it to be kind of helpful when I start to feel that like immense, just the responsibility of like, oh my God, this is so much to tackle. Like
Yeah.
how do I implement change? How do I make change in myself?
I had a thought pop into my head while you were saying all of that. I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, and it's something that I have seen content around recently. And I'm like, yeah, I had the same feeling. So, my oldest is in first grade, and he started school at the public school last year. I was an elementary school teacher, not anymore, but like I have experience in the classroom,
Yeah.
all these things. And last year I signed up for the PTA, like just,
Uh,
you pay your little fee
yeah.
and was like, oh, maybe I'll do something with it. And we got the list of who was in the PTA, and it was all names that I perceived to be women.
Hmm.
I'm assuming mothers.
Hmm.
And I was like, I don't know. I don't think I can do this. Like, I don't know that I
Yeah.
can contribute to the PTA in this way. And that has been like a conscious decision since to
Hmm.
not get involved, which
Yeah.
feels very strange to me because I'm like, I
Yeah.
think I probably would be like a good person to like be in that role, but also it's like unpaid labor that falls
Yeah.
on mothers. And so I think why that came up is it's like sometimes it's action, but sometimes it's intentional decisions. And
Uh-huh.
it's like that kind of intentional
Yeah.
decision. I still grapple with that of like, I mean,
Totally.
what I don't, like where do I fall in my beliefs with this? But I'm like, but I that does bother me
Yeah.
that it's all
Yeah.
moms and
Totally.
I don't really want to contribute to that system.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And I think in some ways it can be taking a stand, or activism can be in setting a boundary or
Mhm.
saying no, right? And yet it's countercultural, right? Like you're intentionally kind of going against the grain, which is this embedded belief that this is what a good mom does,
Mhm.
right? A good mom volunteers their time and is in the classroom and is actively involved. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And to your point, it is unpaid labor. It is, a huge commitment of one's time, right? And it's interesting because it makes me think of a lot of the work that I do in the kind of fair play space, right? And Eve Rodsky talks a lot about how our time, women's time, is often undervalued and it's seen as undepleting, right? Like there's just
Mhm.
this like ample amount of time, even though we have the same 24 hours in a day as men do, we're fathers, and yet their time is kind of protected. She says that like their time is like diamonds and our time is like sand. It's just like this fleeting thing. And when we kind of prioritize and claim our time and saying, is this something, right,
Yeah.
that I deem as important? And a person might, and they may prioritize that either in this season of life or in this particular time. But it is, I think, recognizing like part of that does require saying no at times. And
Mhm.
that's incredibly uncomfortable. And I've had that same experience, right? I have my oldest just started kindergarten. And it's like I'm inundated with volunteer opportunities. And someone, again, similarly, like I was worked in the school systems. Like I just am so supportive of all of it. And yet I have to be really intentional about my time. And I notice myself feeling that kind of like social pressure to get involved. And I have to kind of slow it down and be like, wait, hold on. What am I feeling called to do right now? What do I have the bandwidth and the capacity for? How do I want to show up? What's going to feel most meaningful to me and to my family, and kind of asking like, well, what's my why? And so I went to like, we have a fair that you can walk around and sign up at different booths. And there was one about our schools. You might have this too, like the rock and roll, right? Where you like bike or walk or stroll to
Okay.
school.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay, moving our body and nature and getting outside, this is something that I really enjoy. So that feels like a good match for me, right? The kind of requirement felt like it fit within like what I had the capacity for. And so it was like this kind of okay, what matters to me? What do I want to model to my kids? And how do we kind of start there? But it is like, I really can see how hard it is and how easy it is to just get kind of caught up in that and be like, okay, all the things, right? And then, of course, it can lead to burnout and
Hmm.
exhaustion and resentment, right? That why is
Yeah.
it that it's predominantly the moms who are at the meetings and things? And I think part of it is too also to helping make the invisible more visible, right? To give light to how hard it is, all the mental load, all
Yeah.
that goes into these events, right? Or getting our kids prepared to start the school year, right? I mean, my God, it was just going through kind of becoming a kindergarten mom. Even though I had had experience in the classrooms and, I'd done all this stuff, like I was just floored by how much work it is, right? Just incredible mental load. And I was intentional on my partner about kind of divvying stuff. And so, for instance, we had signups for the after school programs, and I very intentionally kind of offloaded that onto my partner and said, okay, I want like you sign up. And it was a really interesting experience because he got the experience of waking up at like 6 in the morning, which is when you have to sign up, and the system crashed, and he had this appreciation and awareness for just what
Yeah.
goes into signing a kid up for an after school Legos extracurricular or something. Those kind of small ways in which a lot of times the division of labor and kind of looking at that can be also acts of resistance right within the home front. And
Yeah.
so I think there's intentional ways to do that too.
Yeah, and I think something important there is it's sometimes the labor of making those decisions and offloading still
Yeah.
does fall on the mother, but
Yeah.
acknowledging that these are also generational
Yeah.
changes we're talking about, that it's
Yeah.
hopefully there can be some sort of acceptance of that while
Mm-hmm.
also
Mm-hmm.
frustration and all the
Yeah.
things because it's
Yeah.
that's reasonable. Yeah, really interesting conversations and I really
Mm-hmm.
think it's good to just kind of like talk about these things and talk about the
Yeah.
complexity of making decisions when you are trying to do right by your own values and beliefs. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's really obvious what choice to make, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's not and there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
more consideration and that can be a lot of mental labor. And so just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
releasing the pressure to always make the right decision and also knowing that you do have the agency in those
Mm-hmm.
decisions. There's kind of
Mm-hmm.
that balance there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, talking specifically about what mothers can do, I know we've talked about a lot of things, especially in
Mm-hmm.
terms of kind of like the resistance part of it and the
Mm-hmm.
focus on the
Mm-hmm.
internal and education and having those conversations. But if we look at this on a little bit bigger of a scale, what can moms do to take
Yeah.
action?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's so many different ways to get
Yeah.
involved, and that engagement piece, it can look so many ways. I'm a really big fan of Emily Amick. She's on Instagram as Emily in Your Phone. She's got some wonderful ideas around kind of how to show up and be more politically, kind of civically engaged. And she actually just helped to co-write a book called Democracy in Retrograde. And she actually has kind of a quiz around thinking about how you show up. What is your level of civic participation or engagement, right? So she talks about there's like the leaders, there's the actors, there's the givers, there's the creators. And so I think just kind of starting with like, how do you like to show up
Hmm.
in a group or an organization, right? Not everyone has to take on the kind of PTA president role, for instance, right? But some people who might feel more called towards creation or designing something, right? So, like, kind of just starting there and honoring that, right? So, somebody who is more introverted naturally, right? The idea of door knocking, right? Or phone banking might feel like wildly intimidating, right? And that's okay. So it's like acknowledging that it can look so many different ways. So I think that's a big part of it is like acknowledging and recognizing where you are, who you are, and kind of what you enjoy most. Because at the end of the day, it also has to feel enjoying. It has to feel like it's something that lights you up, right? And then, thinking about just kind of like your sphere of influence, right? Like who are the people in your life? Who are the influences that you can talk to? And it doesn't have to be, this grand level. It can be, the friends that we're having conversations with in real life, right? Emily Amick talks about this idea of like the public square, and how in the past we would have these like communal places where we would all come together and talk and share ideas and advocate for things. And we don't have that in the same way, right? For many, it's social media. And so obviously that can be a way for people to engage and show up, right? Sharing content or information or education that matters to you. But it can also be just becoming more informed, right? So following organizers or organizations that are in line with your belief systems, sharing content, those kinds of things. But I also think there's ways in which kind of utilizing the communal gathering places that we have around that. So it's like, the school pickup or school drop off, right? Sports events, right? When we're kind of all together, are there opportunities to even just start on a level of just acknowledging and talking about motherhood and what it entails and some of the complexities of it, right? Finding ways to just share that relational organizing, like I said earlier, and taking steps like if there's a lawn sign that you get for either like a local politician that you support or even a federal politician that you support, right? Like kind of having your house be a place where you say, this is our belief system, this is who we're promoting, right? It's a pretty incredible conversation starter when you have something that visibly says, this is what I believe in, or this is the person that I support, right? Bumper stickers. I'm also a huge fan of political merchandise. So I know this election season, I have gone way overboard. And so I love to make a statement through the clothes that I wear, the shirts that I have. And it's a really good conversation starter. And there's a lot of BIPOC women-owned businesses online that you can kind of give your money and support and financial support, but also then an opportunity to talk about it. And that might not match for everybody, but just finding ways that kind of are in line with who you are and finding ways to kind of share that out, right? And I think finding community with other like-minded people. I mean, to work at an organization like Planned Parenthood was so incredible because I was with all these incredible like-minded people that believed fundamentally in what I believed in a woman's right to choice and comprehensive education, and all these things. And so I just naturally, aligned with certain people that led to kind of more connections and opportunities even outside of work. So I would say, if there's a particular issue or a particular cause that is deeply important to you, that's a great place to start, right? So for me, reproductive justice is a huge issue for me. I've always been really passionate about it. And so volunteering for causes, right? That for me is kind of a place where I've started and found really good community through.
I love all of that. And I think like my biggest takeaway from that is the kind of just openness and shining the light on whatever it is that you want to make a difference in. So even if that is just being honest about your motherhood experience with a few individuals and normalizing the fact that it's not this perfect little image that we're expected to be, because even just normalizing that for a few people
Yeah.
is huge, shining the light on that,
Yeah.
having those
Yeah.
conversations. But then like wearing something that makes a statement, having a sign out on your lawn, a bumper sticker, anything like that, it's so valuable. It can be so valuable. And again, like you said, it's not for everybody. That's not something
Yeah.
you have to do, but it's just kind of opening those lines of communication, opening those lines of connection, because whatever the next step then looks like,
Mhm.
a lot of times it's in those relationships we have where we can make a difference, again, a big difference, or just like small with a little bit of ripple effects. And
Yeah,
either way is
absolutely.
beautiful.
Yeah, and just having those conversations. Another way that comes to mind is, there's just so much commentary and information and just discussions about motherhood right now, right? So whether it's hosting a book club, right, where the books are about some aspect of mothering, right, which just kind of generates this conversation about what that entails, right? I'm a huge fan of like pop culture, reality TV, all that stuff that's like part of my self-care. And oftentimes these television shows, these series are commentary about modern motherhood, right? So like using pop culture or things that like to talk about it, right? At a mom's night or at a soccer game or something, right? It's like, if you look around, there's so much conversations. But so like you said, just kind of acknowledging it and naming it, I think is a really, really helpful. And it doesn't have to be, this serious commentary and discussion. It can also be, wow, let's let's talk about, motherhood in the realm of the Bravo space, which is my personal choice.
Okay, I think this is a sign. I've had so many conversations recently with people who are really into Bravo, and I'm like, I
Oh,
know it would be my jam, and I've never gotten into the
oh,
Bravo shows, the Housewives shows,
oh.
all the stuff, and this is like the fourth time it's come up this week, so I think I need to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
on it.
Well, when you're ready to do a deep dive about motherhood in the context of the Bravo sphere, I'm your girl.
Oh, love it. I'm gonna hit you up with that.
Yeah.
Christina, this conversation has been incredible. I mean, we've touched on so many things, and I think a lot of it has been really tangible. And also, I don't know, I hope this feels more approachable to anyone listening who
Yeah.
maybe that kind of idea of like doing
Mhm.
something about the state of motherhood and the state of
Mhm.
parenting and all of that. Like it might feel more approachable.
Mhm.
Before we exit this conversation, I love asking guests about their own self care. I'm like a huge
Mhm.
believer that normalizing moms caring for themselves is a huge piece of the puzzle because it's often just said that we shouldn't. We just, you don't need to. You don't need time for yourself. So I would love to know how you take care of yourself and just if you have any advice for moms to make sure that they are taking care of themselves regularly.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's interesting. I actually just wrote a blog post about this, kind of how to protect our mental health during the election season, right? When it's just easy to get inundated and overwhelmed with just a lot of information and worries around, just the landscape and what the future looks like. So I think it's really important. I mean, obviously, self care is always important, but I think right now it's pretty essential. And for moms, we know it's absolutely essential, right? We have to start with ourselves. So I think if that's maybe the biggest takeaway from today is that like self care is a revolutionary act, right? So like naming and acknowledging that we matter as moms is really profoundly important. And I try my best to model that, right? In my relationships, in my family, acknowledging that it's hard, right? And I'm kind of deprogramming myself and unlearning some things around kind of the, self-sacrificing mother. So forcing myself to practice what I preach. And so I find taking breaks, having alone time where I just can be by myself, not touched, not asked for 8 zillion snacks, right? Find connection with other women to be really important. So have kind of built this really awesome group of pretty badass mom friends and therapist friends. And so just being able to lean on that, I think is a really important piece of it. I'm also a big fan of escapism. So sometimes it is just reading a book or watching a reality show and just kind of tapping out so that I can tap back in and just normalizing that kind of push pull that comes with this, that we can't be on all the time, that we have to kind of take time for ourselves. And yet it's really hard to do. So I think that's a moving target for all of us and one that I still kind of get to work on myself. And just remembering kind of the parts of me that are important outside of my identity as a mom. I spend a lot of time, being a mom, talking with moms, holding space about moms. So it's nice to have times and outlets where I can focus on other parts of my identity as an athlete or as, I like to run and I like to work out. And so just kind of being able to like put that part of me first.
I love all of that. And I think it's a lot of good mindset pieces that can help
Yeah.
us approach self care in a more productive way. I mean, really, like to be able
Yeah.
to say, making the time for myself is important. Also, it's hard. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to beat myself up over not caring for myself as much as I probably, quote, should be or whatever. So I think
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
really powerful.
Yeah.
Christina, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was such a pleasure. I just love talking about all these things. Thank you for having
It's
me.
important stuff. Where
Yeah.
can listeners find more of your work? Connect with
Yeah.
you?
So I am online. I'm on Instagram at Christina Klein MFT. I also have my website, Christina Klein MFT, that you can find me at, where I'm constantly posting blogs and just information and support around kind of the navigating the ups and downs of motherhood. So I'm based in California, so I do see clients individually. So if people are interested in working with me, they're welcome to reach out. And then I actually launched a group a couple months ago for moms called Surviving Modern Motherhood, which is a lot of kind of what we talked about today, which is just holding space for moms to talk about just the complexity complexities and the nuances of being a mom now in this day and age. I'm going to be starting my next group in January. So if people are interested in that, you do have to be California based, but we'll be recruiting for that. So people can reach out if they want to join that. And it's just an incredible space to talk about a lot of what we talked about today.
How amazing. Such important things, such important support for moms. And I'm so happy that we were able to bring this
Yeah.
conversation forward at like such an important moment in history, too.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving space to this.
Yes. Thank you for tuning in. You being here listening to this is important. It matters. You matter. We need to be having conversations like this. We need to be recognizing our agency in making change for ourselves and for future generations and for everyone living right now, everyone mothering right now. It's important to know that we do have power, we do have say, and that can look as small as just prioritizing time for yourself. So I hope that there's something for you to take from this conversation and just kind of think about in your own life. With that, I'll see you next week. You are worthy, Mama.